The arrow was still in her shoulder when she walked into Warren Hudson's surgery tent. He heard her before he saw her, the thud of boots heavy enough to shake the ground, the grunt of canvas being shoved aside without ceremony, and then she was simply there, filling the entrance like a wall had grown legs and learned to bleed. 7 feet of green-skinned, dark-haired orc woman, dripping blood from her left shoulder onto his only clean floor cloth, and staring at him with amber eyes that held all the warmth of a winter sky. "You are the surgeon," she said. It was not a question. Warren set down the bone, saw he'd been cleaning, and looked up at her. He was 32 years old, lean as a fence post, with the kind of face that suggested he'd spent most of his life outdoors without quite remembering to enjoy it. He'd stitched men who'd screamed, men who'd wept, men who'd tried to bite him, and at least one man who died mid-sentence telling him he was going to be fine. He thought he was used to surprises. He was wrong. "Field apothecary," he said, because precision mattered. "Warren Hudson, sit down before you fall down." She looked at the camp stool he pointed to, and even from across the tent he could see the calculation, whether it would hold her, whether sitting was something she was willing to do in front of a human she hadn't decided to trust yet. Then something in her face shifted just slightly and she sat. The stool did not break, which he considered a small miracle. Up close, she was extraordinary. Her traveling leathers were well-made and form-fitting. A dark, oiled leather bodice laced tightly over a deep crimson undershirt that had once been fine and was now torn at the collar, cinched with a wide belt at the waist, and close-fitted trousers tucked into boots that rose to her knee. The ensemble moved with her like a second skin, and even blood-soaked and battle-dusty, she carried herself like a woman who expected the world to rearrange itself around her. She had tusks, not the broad, blunt kind, but elegant lower fangs that curved upward and framed a generous, expressive mouth. Her dark hair was war-braided, thick as rope, and her face had the kind of angular beauty that would have stopped a room stone cold if she'd walked into it without a crossbow bolt protruding from her left shoulder. "The arrow," he said, moving toward her with his kit. "I know," she said. "I'm going to have to remove it. It will hurt." She looked at him the way you look at someone who has just told you that water is wet. "I know," she said again. "Do it." Her name, she told him between his work and her controlled breathing, was Ursa Bloodhorn. She was a war captain of the Grimtide clan, 26 years old, and she had ridden through a burning borderland to reach this temporary field station, because 2 things were true. Her own clan's healer had died in the raid, and she had heard there was a human surgeon operating out of the ruined inn at Ashwood Crossing who didn't ask questions about which side you'd been on. "People say that about me," Warren said, cutting the arrowhead free with 2 clean strokes of a blade he kept sharper than most men kept their swords. "People say you keep your hands busy and your opinions quiet," she said, and then the arrowhead came out, and she made a sound low and controlled, not a scream, just a hard exhale of breath through her nose, and didn't move otherwise. He pressed a cloth against the wound with both hands and held it there, and she turned her head and looked directly at him for the first time since she'd sat down. "You didn't flinch," she said. "I've been doing this for 11 years. I stopped flinching a while back. Most human surgeons flinch when they touch an orc. Most human surgeons haven't had as much practice with large patients," he said, perfectly serious, and something shifted in her amber eyes. Not quite a smile. Something that might have been the precursor to one. The borderland was called the Ashwood Corridor, and it had been burning, one way or another, for most of the past decade. It was a strip of land 30 miles wide between the Keld Mountains to the north and the lowland farms to the south. Contested, brutal, and currently smoldering from a raid 3 days ago that had swept out of the north with enough force to level 2 human settlements and scatter half a dozen orc encampments that had nothing to do with the raiding party. The Grimtide clan were not the aggressors. They were, in fact, nominally bound to a 3-year treaty with the border authority, but that distinction was not one that stopped crossbow bolts in flight, and it had not stopped whoever had put one in Ursa Bloodhorn's shoulder. Warren stitched her up. He'd stopped flinching, yes, but he hadn't stopped noticing, and he noticed that she was watching him work with an expression he couldn't quite read, not suspicion, not gratitude, just an intent, unblinking attention that made the back of his neck feel warm. She was twice his height, which was not a metaphor. Sitting down, she was still nearly eye level with him when he stood, and her arms were built like young trees. She could have snapped him in half without breathing hard. She sat instead and let him fuss, which was how he'd have described it, fussing, the thing he did when he was trying to be useful in a world that mostly produced wounds faster than he could close them. "You have skilled hands," she said, when he was tying off the final stitch. "Thank you." "I am not giving you a compliment, I am making an observation." "I know," he said. "Thank you anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long have you been in the corridor?" 8 months. Came up from Ventry after the summer raid started. Figured they needed someone with supplies more than they needed another sword." "You are not a soldier." "No. Yet you stay." He set down the needle and wrapped her shoulder with clean linen, pulling the bandage snug with practiced hands. "Someone has to." She looked at him for a long moment, as though she was filing the information away somewhere important. Then she stood all 7 feet of her, straightening to full height and rolling her uninjured shoulder experimentally. The tent felt smaller than it had before she'd arrived, though he suspected it always would now. "I will pay you," she said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to, I choose to." She reached into a pouch at her belt and set a small, heavy coin on his supply table, old silver, the kind minted in the mountain holds, worth more than a week's worth of market trade. "Your stitching is worth that." He didn't argue. Surgeons in the corridor could not afford pride, and she'd said it without pity, which mattered. She was halfway through the tent flap when he said, "That shoulder needs checking in 3 days if you're still in the area." She paused. "Why would you assume I will be in the area?" "I assume nothing. I'm informing you as a matter of medical necessity that the stitches need checking. What you do with that information is your business." Another long pause. The canvas flap let in a slant of gray afternoon light that caught the side of her face and made the line of her jaw look like something carved deliberately. 3 days, she said finally, and left. She came back in 2. Warren was grinding dried lung moss into a preparation when the tent shook again, and she ducked through the entrance with the same total absence of announcement. Her shoulder was moving well, he could see that at a glance, but she was holding her right forearm at a careful angle, and when she set it on his work table he saw why. A long, clean cut, the kind a blade makes when it barely misses something important. "Sit down," he said. "It is minor," she said, but she sat. "You came 2 days early," he said, beginning to clean the cut. "The stitches needed checking," she said, perfectly straight-faced, and this time the thing in his chest that moved was unmistakably amusement. He worked. She watched him with those amber eyes. Outside, the corridor was still smoldering. You could smell it, that particular combination of ash and cold mud that had become the characteristic scent of the entire region. The border authority had sent a garrison to Ashwood Crossing after the raid, which meant there were now 200 soldiers camped within a mile of Warren's surgery tent, which meant he was working around the clock, which meant he was averaging roughly 4 hours of sleep, and had forgotten what a proper meal tasted like. "You look tired," Ursa said. "I am tired. You should sleep." There will always be still something," she said, with a kind of flat certainty that stopped him mid-sentence. "If you collapse, you help no one. Sleep." "Are you giving me orders?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," he blinked. Then, startled out of his usual composure, he laughed, a short, real sound that surprised both of them. "I'll sleep when I'm finished with your arm." "Acceptable," she said. He checked her shoulder stitches while he was at it. Healing clean, no infection, she had a constitution that made him briefly envious. He told her so, and she accepted it with the same matter-of-fact grace she accepted everything. Over the next week she came back 3 more times, once for the stitches to be removed. Once because two of her clansmen had been injured in a skirmish with a retreating raiding party, and she had carried them both to his tent on her own back, one over each shoulder, and stood outside with her arms folded while he worked. He'd asked her to come in out of the cold, and she'd said she was fine where she was, and he'd looked at her standing in the gray drizzle with her jaw set, and thought that he'd never seen anyone look more alone while simultaneously refusing to acknowledge it. The third time she came alone in the evening, and she didn't have a visible injury. She stood in the tent entrance for a moment with an expression he was beginning to recognize as the one she wore when she was doing something she hadn't entirely planned. "The garrison commander has decided to requisition your supply tent," she said. "He sent a runner an hour ago." Warren set down the tin he was labeling. "How do you know that?" "Because I was walking past his command post, and I can hear through canvas walls when people are being idiots." She stepped fully inside. "I told the runner that this tent is under Grimtide clan medical protection, which is technically not a claim I have formal authority to make, but the runner did not know that." Warren stared at her. "You bluffed the border authority garrison." "I made a creative statement of jurisdiction," she said. "Your supplies are safe tonight, but you should speak to the commander tomorrow before I run out of creative statements." "Why did you do that?" She met his eyes without hesitation. "Because your supplies keep people alive and because I decided you should not lose them." She paused. "Also because the garrison commander is an idiot and I find idiocy irritating." "Which reason was first?" he asked. A beat. "The first one," she said, and there was something in her voice that was quieter than the rest of her. "He went to speak to the commander the next morning and spent 40 minutes arguing his case with a man who seemed to regard a field apothecary as a luxury. When he returned, he found that Ursa had spoken to the commander herself in the interim. He didn't know what she'd said, but the requisition notice had been withdrawn, and the commander's aide looked like a man who'd recently been in a conversation he hadn't enjoyed. Warren's supply tent remained his. He brought her a cup of the dense, bitter camp tea that passed for hospitality in the corridor that evening, and handed it to her outside her own encampment. She looked at the cup, then at him. "You tracked me down to bring me tea," she said. "You saved my supplies, it seemed like the minimum." She took the cup. Her fingers were long and green-gray and capable, and they dwarfed the tin cup without making it look ridiculous. She drank, made a face. "This is terrible. The corridor doesn't have good tea." "I know," she said. "I have been here for 2 months." She kept drinking anyway, and he stood beside her in the cold dusk while she finished it. And that was the first evening they simply stood together without a medical reason. It would not be the last. Winter arrived in the Ashwood Corridor the way it arrived everywhere along the Keld Mountains, without warning and without mercy. One night there was frost. The next morning there was a foot of snow and a wind that came off the peaks like a physical blow. The temperature dropped so fast that green wood in the supply stores split overnight, and Warren woke to find that 3 of his patients had developed fevers in the cold, and that his own fingers were going numb in the tent. He moved his surgery into the ruined in itself Ashford Crossing's old way station, half a roof still intact, walls solid enough to block the wind. He set up his worktable in what had been the common room, rigged oil lanterns from the ceiling beams, and spent the better part of 2 days making the space functional, while the temperature outside dropped to the kind of cold that killed people who weren't paying attention. Ursa arrived on the second day, with 2 of her clanspeople and a sledge loaded with materials, thick hide panels from their winter stores, iron pegs, rope, and a small but heavy iron brazier that looked like it had been dragged from the floor of an old Grimtide war camp. She began installing the hides over the gaps in the inn's walls without being asked. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. She was driving an iron peg into a gap between 2 stone blocks with her bare hands, which required no tool because her hands were apparently made of something stronger than most tools. "One of my clanspeople will need surgery in 2 days. I want the space to be warm when that happens." "Which clansperson?" "Davar. Gut wound, half-healed wrong. He has been pretending it is not a problem." She drove another peg home. "He is an idiot about it, but he is my responsibility." Bring him tonight. I'd rather see it before it gets worse. Tonight, she agreed. Davor came, was examined, was sedated with a preparation Warren had been developing from northern bark and river moss, and was operated on by firelight while Ursa sat outside the door. Warren heard her pacing long, slow, deliberate strides that covered the length of the ruined inn's hallway and back, over and over, for the 2 hours it took. When he emerged, blood on his hands and tired in a way that went past his bones, she was standing in the hallway with her arms crossed and her expression carefully controlled. "He will live," Warren said. "It was close. Another week and it wouldn't have been." He watched the breath go out of her, not a sigh, just a slow release of something she'd been holding very tightly. Her jaw unclenched. Her shoulders, all of them, all 7 feet of their considerable weight, dropped half an inch. "Thank you," she said. It came out different from the way she usually said things. Quieter, real. "Thank you for the hides and the brazier. It made the difference." She nodded. Then she looked at him for a long moment, in that particular way she had, not searching, more like taking stock, like a person adding up a column of figures and arriving at a number they hadn't expected. "You are cold," she said. "You have been working for hours in an imperfectly heated space." "I'm all right." "You are not all right. You are shivering." "I'm not," he stopped, because he was, faintly, the kind of shivering that started in the core and hadn't quite reached his hands yet. He'd been focused on Davor and hadn't noticed. She turned and walked back into the common room where the brazier was burning. He followed, because there wasn't another warm direction to go. She sat down on one of the heavy benches, the only furniture in the room large enough to hold her, and gestured to the spot beside her without ceremony, without softness, just the flat certainty that he was going to sit down and get warm. He sat. She was generating heat the way large warm things do, a kind of steady radiance. He could feel it from a foot away. "You don't sleep enough," she said. "You don't eat enough. You run yourself down to nothing and expect to keep functioning. Someone has to." "There it is again," she said. "Someone has to. You say that as though you personally have been designated the someone by some authority above you." "Haven't I?" She turned her head and looked at him sideways. "You chose this. You chose this border, this tent, this work. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind worked at the hide panels she'd installed, found them sufficient, and moved on. "My father was a soldier," he said. "He came back from the Eastern campaigns with a wound that didn't get treated properly. Spent 5 years dying slowly from something a decent surgeon could have fixed in an afternoon." He looked at his hands. "I apprenticed to an apothecary at 14. I've been stitching people back together ever since." "Because you couldn't stitch him." "Because I couldn't stitch him," he agreed. She was quiet for a while. He'd expected her to say something brisk, something practical, something that held feeling at arm's length the way she usually did. Instead she said, "My mother died in a raid when I was 11. I became war captain of the Grimtide at 23. Every decision I make, every march, every negotiation, every treaty I make because I could not protect her, and I will spend the rest of my life protecting everyone else." The inn was very quiet. The brazier ticked and breathed. "We are," Warren said carefully, "a very specific kind of person." "Yes," she said. "We are." She did not move closer. He did not move closer. But the space between them on the bench felt different than it had a moment before, intentional, charged, measured. She knew exactly how much space she was occupying, and so did he, and neither of them was in any hurry to break the particular quality of that awareness. He said goodnight an hour later. She said goodnight in that calm, level voice. He lay down in his cold bedroll and listened to the wind and thought about amber eyes and the specific, quiet sound of a woman telling him the most important thing about herself. He slept better than he had in weeks. The winter dug in. The garrison at Ashwood Crossing was reinforced, because word had come down from the capital that the raiding parties were organized, not opportunistic, and the border needed to hold. Warren's patient load doubled. He operated in the inn by lamplight most nights, and during the days he distributed medicines to the settlement's remaining civilians. The ones who had not fled south before the snow, made the roads impassable, which was most of them, because most of them were too poor or too stubborn to go. Ursa's clan maintained their camp half a mile east of the inn, sheltering through the winter in heavy hide tents that Warren would have found uncomfortable and Ursa found perfectly adequate. She came to the inn every 2 or 3 days without any stated reason, and she was always useful when she arrived. She had a talent for identifying problems before they became emergencies, and she communicated this talent in the same flat, unadorned way she communicated everything, which Warren had come to find deeply, privately reassuring. She appeared one morning while he was restocking his preparation shelves. She put a small package on his table without preamble, wrapped in oiled hide, tied with a cord. He opened it to find dried berries, hard cheese, and a strip of preserved meat, all of it the Grimtide variety, all of it far better quality than anything currently available in the crossing. "You skipped a meal again," she said. "I asked your assistant. You interrogated my assistant. I asked him one question." She leaned against the wall, the only posture that let her fit comfortably in the low-ceilinged storage room. He volunteered the information. He seemed pleased someone was asking. Warren looked at the food, then at her. "Thank you. Eat while I am here so I know it is actually done." He ate. She watched with the expression she wore when she was satisfied with an outcome she'd engineered. He thought about pointing out that he was 32 years old and could feed himself, and then decided that the food was too good and the observation too true to bother. "You are doing something different," she said, nodding at the shelves. "Reorganizing by preparation time rather than ailment. It's faster when there's a rush." "Smart." She studied the shelves. "Do you need help? Do you know anything about apothecary work?" "No, but I can follow instructions." He handed her a crate of prepared tinctures and showed her the new system, and they spent the next hour reorganizing the storage room side by side, her enormous hands handling the small glass bottles with a focused delicacy that consistently surprised him. She asked precise questions, remembered the answers immediately, and suggested 2 improvements to the organizational logic that were, when he thought them through, genuinely better than his original plan. He told her so. "You sound surprised," she said. "I shouldn't be." "No," she agreed, "you shouldn't." "I apologize." She glanced at him. "It is all right. You are a human in the corridor who has never worked closely with an orc before. I expect more surprise than I have received from you." "Is that why you keep coming back?" he asked before he could think better of it. "To check whether I'm going to be an idiot about it." She was quiet for a moment. "I keep coming back," she said with deliberate precision, "because this is where I want to be." She handed him the last bottle and turned to face him fully, which meant she was looking down at him from a significant height, and he was looking up at her, and neither of them pretended that was anything other than what it was. "Does that require further explanation?" He held her gaze. Something warm and complicated was happening in his chest, and he was experienced enough with his own emotional geography to know what it was, and honest enough with himself to not pretend otherwise. "No," he said. "I think I understand it." "Good," she said, and turned back to the finished shelves. The moment she kissed him was not planned, or at least it didn't feel planned, though Warren later reflected that, with a woman like Ursa Bloodhorn, very few things happened that weren't at least partially deliberate. They were outside, in the early dark of a midwinter evening, standing at the edge of the crossing's east wall, where you could see the tree line and the distant orange glow that meant another fire somewhere in the corridor. It was cold enough to hurt to breathe. She had come to tell him that a message had arrived from the border authority, and that the garrison was planning a push north in the morning, and that she thought he should know because it would likely mean a significant number of casualties by the following evening. He had listened. He had said, "All right." He had looked at the fire glow on the horizon and thought about how many more people he would see on his table tomorrow and the day after, and something in his face must have shown it, because she reached out and turned his face toward hers with 2 fingers under his jaw, the gentlest possible gesture from the most powerful hands he'd ever seen, and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. She was not a tentative person. It was warm and deliberate and certain, and it tasted of the herbed drink her clanspeople brewed, and something else he couldn't name. And when she pulled back, she was watching him with those amber eyes at their most direct. "I have wanted to do that for some time," she said. "I have decided I am done waiting." He looked up at her and felt something unlock in his chest that had been bolted shut for longer than he could specifically remember. "What made you decide?" he said. "You put yourself between a garrison soldier and one of my clanspeople yesterday," she said. "The soldier was twice your weight and armed. You put yourself between them with a tongue lashing and a bandage roll, and it worked, and you walked away from it like it was nothing." She looked at him steadily. "You are not nothing, and I am done waiting for you to figure that out." He kissed her back. She made a low sound of satisfaction, and it echoed off the stone wall and went out into the dark corridor night, and neither of them was cold anymore. The push north happened the next morning. Warren spent the following 3 days as he'd predicted, barely leaving the surgery, working by rotating lamplight, sleeping in 2-hour stretches on a bedroll beside his work table. Ursa's clan did not go north with the garrison. They were bound by treaty to defensive positions only, but she sent 3 of her clanspeople to serve as stretcher-bearers, and she herself appeared in the surgery on the 2nd day of the aftermath, and did what was needed without being asked. Holding patients still, heating water, cutting bandages, and providing the kind of calm, steady physical presence that made a chaotic space feel marginally less chaotic. She had been helping him for 6 hours straight when he finally had a moment to breathe and looked up to find her watching him from across the room. "You're good at this," he said. "I have watched enough surgeons work," she said. "The good ones have a quality of focus that I recognize." "What quality?" "Everything else stops existing," she said. "Just the problem and the hands and what needs to be done." She paused. "You have it." He crossed the room to her, and without thinking, or rather without needing to think, which was different and better, he took her hand. Her fingers closed around his with an ease that suggested they'd been doing this for years. "When this eases up," he said, "I want to take an evening, just an evening. Away from the surgery." "Where?" she said. "Wherever you want." She looked at him for a moment. Then something happened in her face, a slow, rare thing like a door opening, and she smiled. Not the almost smile he'd been cataloging for weeks, but a real one, full and unguarded, and it transformed her entire face into something so unexpectedly warm that he felt it in his sternum. "There is a ridge," she said, 2 miles east of the camp. "You can see the whole corridor from it on a clear night. I will take you there when the work slows." "I'll hold you to that," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I said it." The work slowed, incrementally, as the garrison push brought a temporary ceasefire to the northern reaches of the corridor. Warren took 3 patients off critical watch, discharged 6 more, and had his first full night of sleep in nearly 2 weeks. He woke to find a small parcel outside his door, more food, and this time a small clay pot of something that smelled like spiced honey, with a note that was not a note so much as a single word scratched into the wax seal. "Tonight." He went to the ridge. She was already there, sitting on a flat-topped boulder with her legs stretched out and her arms braced behind her, looking north with that particular quality of stillness she had when she wasn't performing anything for anyone. He climbed up beside her. The boulder was large enough to sit on, but not large enough for both of them to have private space, and neither of them made any effort to maintain distance, and they sat together in the cold, clear dark, while the corridor spread out below them in its ruined beauty. Snow-covered hills, the thread of the Ashwood River, distant fires both purposeful and otherwise, and overhead a sky crammed with more stars than Warren could remember ever seeing. She told him about the Grimtide clan, their history, their migrations, the treaty they'd fought for because war was destroying them as much as it was destroying the humans. She told him that she'd been offered 3 formal clan bonds in the past 4 years and had declined all of them, and that this had been interpreted by most of her clanspeople as evidence of excessive pride and by Ursa herself as evidence of specific and particular preference. "Specific preference for what?" he said. "For the kind of person I have not yet met," she said, "until 8 weeks ago." You knew 8 weeks ago. I suspected, she said, which from her was almost modest. You have the unfortunate quality of becoming more rather than less interesting the more time I spend with you. Is that a complaint? It is an observation. She looked at him sideways. I find it inconvenient. Why inconvenient? Because I am a war captain of the Grimtide with a corridor to manage and an entire clan who depends on my judgment, and I would prefer not to spend significant amounts of time thinking about a human surgeon who organizes his apothecary shelves by preparation time. She paused. And yet, he agreed, and she laughed low and genuine and warm, and it was the best sound the corridor had produced all winter. He put his arm around her, which required some adjustment given the difference in their heights. She was sitting, so it was possible, and she let it happen with a relaxation of her posture that told him it was welcome. She was warm and solid and smelled like snow and wood smoke and the herbed oil her people used for their braids, and she leaned into him just slightly barely perceptible except that he perceived it perfectly. I am not an easy person, she said after a while. I'm not looking for easy. I am demanding, I expect a great deal. So do I, he said. From myself, from work. I've been hoping to find someone who understands that. She was quiet for a moment. I understand that, she said. I know, he said. It's why I'm sitting on this boulder in the cold. She pressed her forehead to the side of his head, brief, warm, deliberate, and said nothing, because there was nothing to add, and that silence was its own complete communication. They stayed until the fire on the northern horizon went out. The town of Redmarket was 12 miles south of Ashwood Crossing and was, in theory, part of the settled borderland, sufficiently inland to be out of the worst of the raiding range, sufficiently established to have a market square, a granary, 3 inns, and a border authority magistrate's office. It was also the only place within a day's ride where Warren could resupply certain critical preparations that he'd run through at a rate he hadn't anticipated. And so, in the first real break of the winter, a 4-day lull during which the temperature lifted enough to make travel viable, and the roads were merely unpleasant rather than actively murderous, he made the trip south. Ursa came with him. He had not asked her to, and she had not announced that she was coming. She had simply appeared beside his supply wagon at dawn with her traveling pack and her amber eyes, and the expression that meant a decision had been made. You don't need to escort me, he said. The road to Redmarket runs through a stretch of broken ground that raiding parties have used twice in the past month, she said. I need to inspect that stretch in any case. The timing's a line. You inspected it last week. I am inspecting it again. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back without blinking. He picked up the reins. Get in or walk, he said. We're losing the good light. She climbed into the wagon, which sagged significantly to one side with the addition of her weight, and then compensated. She sat beside him on the bench, close enough that the warmth of her was palpable, and he suspected she knew exactly what she was doing, and they drove south through the white and gray morning with the cold coming off the mountain to their left and the smoke of Ashwood Crossing fading behind them. They talked. They were becoming good at talking, not the surface exchange of practical information, which they'd been doing efficiently since the beginning, but the deeper kind, the kind where a person said something that mattered and watched to see what it meant in the other person's face. She told him about the clan councils she'd had to chair since she was 23, the arguments she'd had to win through sheer force of logic in a culture that also respected force of other kinds. He told her about the 7 years he'd spent as a traveling apothecary before the corridor, moving between towns, never staying, serving for a season and moving on. Why, she said. Why move? I wasn't finding anything worth staying for, he said. Any given town, I'd be useful for a while, and then the urgency would pass and I'd just be the apothecary who lived on the edge of town and didn't have much to say for himself at the market. He shrugged. Moving kept me useful. And now, she said. And now I'm in the most useful place I've ever been, he said. And I've stopped thinking about moving. She didn't comment on that directly, but her shoulder was solidly against his for the rest of the drive, and neither of them moved away. Redmarket in winter was a dim, heavily layered town, people in thick furs, market stalls only half occupied, the kind of gray sky that made everything look like an illustration from an old book about hard times. Warren pulled the wagon into the market square, tied the horse, and was already composing his supply list when he realized the square had gone quiet. Not natural quiet, the other kind. People were stopping, staring. Not at him. He was ordinary enough to pass through any space without creating this particular kind of stillness. They were staring at Ursa, who had climbed down from the wagon and was standing in the market square at her full height, and who was looking around with the calm, appraising expression she wore when she was assessing a situation and had not yet determined whether it required action. A dozen stares became 2 dozen. A mother pulled a child behind her back. A merchant at the nearest stall took 3 steps backward. Warren heard someone say, distinctly, the word orc in a tone that was not a greeting. He had seen this before in smaller doses, the double takes, the calculations, the way people sorted their feelings about orc human history into a face they thought was neutral but wasn't. He had always disliked it. Watching it directed at someone he knew, someone whose shoulder he'd stitched and whose laughter he'd heard on a cold ridge, was a different kind of thing entirely. Then a man in the crowd, heavyset, red-faced from the cold or from something internal, dressed in the plain work clothes of a borderland farmer, raised his voice and said, "This is a Redmarket square. We don't have orc business here." The square went still, the kind of still that precedes something worse. Ursa's chin came up. She said nothing. Her hands were still at her sides, but the quality of her stillness had changed. It was the stillness of something that was choosing, very deliberately, what it was going to do next. Warren stepped between them. He did it without planning it, without making a speech in his head first. He simply stepped out from behind the wagon and put himself between Ursa and the crowd and stood there. He was not impressive in any physical sense. He was lean and medium height, and wearing the practical coat of a field apothecary with the kit bag still over his shoulder, and he looked, objectively, like someone who had no business being a barrier between anything. But he stood there and he looked at the red-faced man and he said, in the carrying, matter-of-fact voice he used when he was telling someone unwelcome information about their own body, "This woman is a Grimtide war captain operating under the Corridor Treaty. She is here with me on a medical supply run at the authority of the border garrison at Ashwood Crossing." None of this was untrue. None of it was exactly the full picture either. "I don't care what she is," the man said. "We've had raids. We've had losses. I'm not standing in a square with—" "Your losses are real," Warren said, and there was no apology in his voice, just the flat acknowledgement of fact. "The losses at the crossing are real. The people on my surgery table right now are real. The woman standing behind me has nothing to do with the raids. She is treaty-bound, and she is under my protection. And if you have a legal complaint about her presence, you are welcome to walk to the magistrate's office and file it." He paused. "Otherwise, I have supplies to purchase and a long road back, and I'd appreciate not spending it on this." The square was very quiet. The red-faced man looked at Warren. Then slowly he looked at Ursa, really looked, past the first flash of whatever he'd felt, to the woman actually standing there. Tall, still, not frightened, not threatening, just present. Something complicated moved through his face. He said nothing more. He turned and walked away. The crowd shuffled and dispersed, not entirely but enough, the way crowds do when the particular suspended moment passes and everyone remembers they had somewhere to be. The merchant at the nearest stall, who had backed up 3 steps, came forward 1 step and started very loudly rearranging his goods. Warren turned around. Ursa was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before. It was not the flat assessment, or the measuring look, or the almost smile. It was something stripped clean of all those layers, direct and unguarded, and something that in a less self-possessed woman he might have called moved. She said very quietly, just for him, "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. I wanted to. She stepped toward him, one step which brought her very close, close enough that he had to look up and she had to look down, and the whole geometry of it was theirs alone. She cupped his face in both hands, enormous, warm, careful, and looked at him for a long moment. "Warren Hudson," she said, "you are the most inconveniently decent person I have ever met. Is that bad?" "No," she said, "it is not bad at all." She kissed him there in the Redmarket square, in front of whoever was left to see, with the cold winter sky above them and the smell of wood smoke and market goods and the distant Keld mountains at their backs. It was not a small kiss, and she didn't rush it, and when she let him go his kit bag had slid off his shoulder and he'd missed it entirely. They bought the supplies. They drove back to the crossing through a winter afternoon that had turned, inexplicably, golden, the low sun turning the snow to something that looked like hammered copper. Ursa rode with her arm around his shoulders, which was technically impractical for driving and practically perfect for everything else. The winter ordeal proper began 10 days later. A second push came from the north, not raiding parties this time, but a full organized assault, the kind that the border authority had been anticipating and still managed to be caught partially off guard by. The garrison at Ashwood Crossing held, but the corridor went from a smoldering crisis to an acute one overnight, and for 12 days Warren did not stop moving. He slept in the surgery. He ate whatever someone put in front of him, and the only reason he ate at all was that Ursa appeared twice a day with food, and a look that communicated she would stand there until he consumed it, which he did. She was in the thick of it too. The Grimtide clan's defensive position kept them out of the main conflict, but the edges blurred in ways that nobody had officially sanctioned, and Ursa was managing her people through a set of threats that kept shifting shape. She was magnificent at it. Warren watched her, in the moments he had to watch anything, with a kind of awe that he didn't have the spare capacity to properly articulate. She made decisions in seconds that other commanders agonized over for hours, and she made them right, and she carried the weight of every one of them in the set of her shoulders without ever letting it slow her down. She was also, on the 5th day of the assault, injured again. He found out when she walked into the surgery at midnight. He was between patients, washing his hands, and she came in from outside with her jaw set and her left hand pressed to her side. He crossed the room in 3 steps. "How bad?" he said. "Blade," she said. "Shallow, ribs are intact. I checked." "Sit down and let me check," he said. She looked at him for a fraction of a second with the expression that meant she was deciding whether to argue. Then she sat, right there on the surgery bench, huge and blood-soaked and half her war braid come loose, and she let him fuss. That was the word he'd have used, again, fussing, his hands efficient and gentle, unwrapping her vest and shirt collar enough to expose the wound, cleaning it, assessing it, feeling the relief when his hands confirmed what her diagnosis had already told him: ribs intact, shallow, treatable. He worked carefully, aware of the specific quality of her stillness under his hands, not the stillness of someone afraid or passive, but the stillness of someone who had made a deliberate choice to allow something and was keeping still to honor the commitment. "You came here instead of field treating it yourself," he said. "My kit is on the other side of the camp." "Ursa." A pause. "You were awake," she said. "I checked, I could see your lamp." He tied off the last stitch, pressed a clean cloth to it, and held it there. She was eye level with him, even sitting on the high surgery bench, which meant they were very close. Her amber eyes were tired in a way he hadn't seen before, not wavering, just deep tired, the kind of exhaustion that was older than 12 days. "You're doing everything," he said quietly. "For your people. For the garrison, really, more than they know. For me. I do what needs doing. You sound like me." "Yes," she said. "I know." Something in her face was different, the controlled composure still present, but the edges of it softer. "When this is over," she said, "I would like to go back to the ridge." "We will," he said. "You will not move on to the next place." He looked at her. In the lamplight, with her war braid half undone and her jaw still set even in exhaustion and blood on her extraordinary leather bodice, She was the most real person he'd seen in a very long time. He thought about 7 years of moving, of useful seasons in towns that never became home, of the specific quality of a bedroll that was never in the same place twice. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Her shoulders dropped half an inch again, that barely perceptible release that meant something she'd been holding had eased. She reached out and put her hand over his where it was still pressing the cloth to her side, and her fingers were warm. "Good," she said, "just that." And it was everything. The assault broke on the 13th day, not in dramatic fashion but in the grinding way most military momentum eventually breaks. Supply lines frayed, coordination collapsed, and the raiding force dissolved back into the northern heights. The garrison held a formal ceasefire the following morning that nobody much celebrated, because the corridor looked like it had been worked over with a very large and uncaring hand, and celebration requires a certain amount of energy that nobody currently had. Warren slept for 14 hours. He woke to find Ursa sitting in the chair outside his surgery door, not sleeping, just sitting, watching the crossing go about the tentative business of recovery. "You waited," he said. "I wanted to see you wake up," she said, without any particular inflection, which on her was as good as a poem. He brought both of them food from the garrison kitchen, and they sat outside the inn in the thin winter sunlight that was, 3 weeks past the solstice, finally beginning to have opinions about warmth again. She ate with the decisive efficiency she brought to everything. He ate and watched the crossing and thought about nothing in particular for the first time in months, which was the deepest luxury available in the corridor. "My clanspeople think I have taken a human partner," she said, with the air of someone reporting a weather observation. "Have you?" he said. "That is what I am ascertaining. By sitting outside my door for 14 hours. By sitting outside your door for 14 hours, she confirmed. He looked at her. "Ursa, Warren, the answer is yes." "If you want it to be yes." She turned to look at him, and the thing in her face, that rare, unguarded opening, was there. "I want it to be yes," she said. "I have wanted it to be yes for some time. I was giving you room to decide without pressure. I decided on a cold ridge in December looking at the corridor from above." She was quiet for a moment. "So did I," she said. "On the same ridge." A pause. "Earlier in the evening than you, I suspect." "Probably," he said. She reached out and tucked a strand of his hair back from his face, a small, intimate gesture, all the more charged for coming from hands that could break stone, and he leaned into it like he was completely undone by it, which he was. "My people have a word," she said, "for a claimed partner, Vethrin. It is not precisely the same as a human marriage bond. It is more binding in some ways. It means I acknowledge you before the clan as mine, and you acknowledge me as yours, and neither of us pretends otherwise." "And do you want that?" he said. "I am telling you about it," she said, very precisely, "because yes." "Then yes," he said. "Yes to all of it." Something tremendous moved across her face, and then the real smile came back, the one that transformed her, that he'd been quietly cataloging since the first time he'd seen it. And she gathered him against her side with one arm, and he went without resistance, because this was where he was meant to be, and he had known it for a while. The Grimtide clan acknowledgement happened 3 days later, at the camp at sunset. Ursa standing before her assembled clan with Warren beside her. He came up to her shoulder and declaring, in her language, and then in the common tongue so he'd understand every word, that Warren Hudson was her Vethrin, that he stood under Grimtide protection, and that anyone with an objection could bring it to her privately and be wrong. There were no objections. There were, from some of the older clanspeople, what looked like expressions of quiet approval, which Warren understood was probably the higher compliment. Davar, who was healed and back on his feet and had apparently been appointed unofficial spokesman for clan sentiment, clapped Warren on the back hard enough to stagger him and said, in heavily accented common tongue, "Good. She has been terrible to be around for 2 months. Very focused on the wagon schedule." "I was focused on logistics," Ursa said. "You were focused on whether the surgeon was going to do something stupid," Davar said, with the immunity to her glare that long acquaintance provides. He grinned at Warren with all his teeth. "You didn't." "I try not to," Warren said. Spring came slowly, the way it does to borderlands, not as a proclamation but as a series of small concessions from the cold, a few degrees at a time, the snow retreating first from the south-facing slopes and then from the valley floors, leaving behind the mud and the scattered debris of a winter's worth of conflict and survival. The Ashwood River ran high and fast with snowmelt, and the trees along its banks were putting out the first cautious green, and Warren watched it all from the door of his surgery with a cup of terrible camp tea and something unclenching in his chest that had been clenched since October. He was still the field apothecary at Ashford Crossing. That had not changed. But the shape of everything else had, in ways that still sometimes caught him off guard in good ways, the best kind. Ursa had established what she called a logistics post at the inn, which in practice meant she spent roughly half her time there and half at the clan camp, coordinating the Grimtide spring movements and the increasingly civil relationship with the garrison, which had improved significantly since the winter assault because mutual survival has a way of clarifying priorities. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun learning apothecary from Warren. Not with any intent to practice it herself, she was clear about that, but because she was Ursa and she found imprecision in things she cared about intolerable. She was a remarkable student. She memorized plant properties faster than any apprentice he'd ever taught, asked questions that went directly to the underlying logic rather than just the procedure, and critiqued his explanations with a directness that was simultaneously challenging and entertaining. "You are a demanding teacher," she said once, after he'd corrected her preparation technique for the third time on the same compound. "You are a demanding student," he said. "You keep asking questions I have to think hard to answer." "Good," she said. "You should be thinking hard." "So should you," he said. "That preparation's still not right." She looked at it. "I know," she said, with a rare note of something almost like frustration. And then she redid it precisely until it was exactly right because that was who she was. One morning in early spring, Warren walked to the garrison command post and had a conversation with the current commander. A new one, the previous commander having been reassigned south, about formalizing the medical station at Ashford Crossing as a permanent treaty facility. It was a longer conversation than he'd hoped and shorter than he'd feared, and it ended with a signed agreement that made the inn officially a cross-border medical post, open to both human settlers and orc clanspeople, and funded by both the Border Authority and the Grimtide clan's treaty allocation. He walked back and told Ursa, and she looked at the paper for a moment and then looked at him and said, "You did that alone. You were in the logistics meeting. You should have waited for me. You'd have made it political, I made it medical. It went better." She considered this. "Acceptable," she said, and then, "Warren, yes, this is a significant thing you have done. Someone had to." She looked at him steadily. "You always say that, but it is always you doing it." "Someone has to," he said, and smiled, and she exhaled in a way that was not quite a laugh and reached out and took his hand, and his fingers closed around hers. The first warm evening came in late spring, when the light stayed long enough to feel generous. The corridor was not healed. Borderlands don't heal quickly, and this one carried decades of history in its soil. But it was quieter, and the particular kind of quiet that meant recovery rather than held breath was settling over the crossing like something earned. Warren was in the surgery cleaning up from the day's work, lighter work than winter, 3 patients, none critical, when Ursa appeared in the doorway and said, "Leave it." He looked up. She was wearing her riding leathers over a clean deep crimson shirt, and her war braid had been redone with meticulous care, woven through with a narrow red cord that he recognized as Grimtide bonding color, and she was looking at him with amber eyes that were warm in a way that still occasionally stopped his breath, even now. "Leave it." He said, "The ridge," she said. "There will not be a better night." He left it. He pulled on his coat and left the lamp burning low and walked with her out of the inn and east along the track through the new green of the Ashwood trees. And the evening smelled like cold water and fresh growth, and something floral he couldn't name. And she walked beside him with the easy, ground-covering stride that meant she was not in a hurry for once. The ridge was everything it had been in winter and more. The valley below was catching the last of the light in the river, and the settlements along it, small warm fires beginning to appear as the dark deepened, and the corridor spread out in its entirety, ruined and recovering and stitched through with the threads of many lives. They sat on the flat-topped boulder. She pulled him close and he went easily, leaning back against her with her arms solid around him, her warmth at his back. It was nothing like the careful distances of 3 months ago. "Are you staying?" she said. "I told you I'm not going anywhere." "I am not asking about leaving," she said. "I am asking about staying. There is a difference." He thought about that, the distinction between not leaving and choosing to be somewhere, the gap between reluctance and purpose. He'd spent a long time in the former category, moving to outrun the feeling of not belonging. He was not in that category anymore. "I am staying," he said. "This is where I am." "With me," she said, not a question. "With you," he said, "specifically and particularly with you." She made a low sound of satisfaction and pressed her face against the top of his head, and they sat in the quiet evening while the corridor below them went about the business of existing, complicated and scarred and persistent, the way things that survive tend to be. "Davar wants to throw a celebration," she said after a while. "For what?" "For us. For the treaty post. For surviving the winter." "He will find a reason." "Should we let him?" "Probably not. He will organize it very badly and everyone will have a terrible time, and then he will do it again next year. I have learned to simply endure it." "That sounds right," Warren said. "Let him." She was quiet for a moment, then softly, "I used to tell myself I did not need this. A person, warmth, a pause. I was wrong. I used to tell myself I was better at moving than staying," he said. "I was wrong too." She tightened her arm around him, and he put his hand over hers where it rested against his chest, and they were quiet together with the full weight of the thing they'd built between them. This specific, unlikely, enduring thing, made of stitches and supply shelves and cold ridges and a public square in Redmarket and 14 hours in a chair outside a door. "Ursa," he said. "Warren. I love you." She was quiet for long enough that he had time to notice the particular shape of that silence. Then, "I know," she said. "I love you. I have loved you since the tent, I think, when you told me to sit down before I fell down a beat." "I did not fall down." "No," he said. "You never do." "I sat," she said, "and let you fuss." "You did," he said, "and then you came back 2 days early. The stitches needed checking." "The stitches were fine." "I know," she said, and there was warm laughter in her voice, low and genuine. "I came back because I wanted to." She turned her face against his hair. "I always come back because I want to." "Good," he said. "I'll always be here." "I know," she said. "That is why I keep coming back." Below them, the corridor was dark and lit by fires, and the river caught starlight, and somewhere in the Grimtide camp someone was playing a low-stringed instrument that sent its notes up into the spring evening like smoke. The night was not cold. Warren settled more fully against her, and she held him, and neither of them felt even slightly like moving. The new surgery post opened its doors officially at the start of the following month, with a carved wooden sign above the door. Warren had carved it himself, badly, which Ursa had pointed out and then kept entirely to herself around anyone else. That read ASHFORD Crossing Medical Post, Treaty Facility, in both the common script and the angular Grimtide letters she'd taught him to copy, which he'd done with the same precision he brought to stitching. On the first morning, 6 patients came. 2 were garrison soldiers. 2 were Grimtide clanspeople. 2 were settlers from the south edge of the corridor, who'd heard through some efficient borderland network that there was a surgeon who kept his hands busy and his opinions quiet. Warren treated all 6 of them and documented everything in the new ledger with the careful handwriting that 7 years of field records had refined to something almost elegant. Ursa ran the morning logistics meeting with the garrison liaison at the table in what had been the common room, with Davar taking notes, and a young clansperson named Keth serving tea that was, for the first time in Warren's experience of the corridor, not terrible, because Ursa had sourced actual good tea from somewhere she refused to specify. By the afternoon, the post was functioning. By the evening, it felt ordinary in the best possible way, like something that had always been there, like it belonged. Warren locked the supply cabinets and banked the brazier and walked out into the spring evening to find Ursa already there, leaning against the wall outside the door with her arms crossed and her eyes on the sky. "Good first day," she said. "Very good," he agreed. "The garrison liaison is going to be difficult about the budget." "I will handle the garrison liaison," she said. "I know you will," he said. "That's why I told you." She unfolded her arms and put one around his shoulders, pulling him into her side with easy certainty, and he put his arm around her waist as high as he could comfortably reach, which was not as high as most people's waists, but was exactly the right place for him. "Avar's celebration is next week," she said. "I remember. It will be chaotic, probably. He is planning music, the kind that requires participation." "Then we'll participate," Warren said. He felt her look down at him. "What? You have never participated in Grimtide celebration music. How hard can it be?" "Very hard," she said. "You have no sense of rhythm." "I have excellent sense of rhythm. I use it in surgery." "That is completely different. It is absolutely the same." She made the sound that was her most frequent response to him being wrong in an entertaining way, the low exhale, the subtle shift in her expression that was somewhere between fondness and exasperation, and said, "I will teach you the easier parts." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." She looked at him again with the warm and particular directness that was hers alone. "I find I consistently want to, with you." She paused. "It is still inconvenient." "Less than before?" he asked. She thought about this with characteristic seriousness. "Yes," she said, "considerably less. The inconvenience has become something else." "What?" "Something I would not trade," she said. Simply, without ornamentation, the way she said the things that mattered most. The spring sky above the corridor was clear. The kind of clear that happens after a long, hard winter and a longer, harder year. And the stars were coming out one by one over the Keld Mountains to the north. And Warren Hudson, field apothecary, treaty post administrator, and veteran of the Grimtide war captain Ursa Bloodhorn, stood in the last of the evening light and thought that this, right here, this specific weighted arm and this warm side, and this particular amber-eyed woman who had walked into his surgery tent with an arrow in her shoulder, and looked at him like she was taking stock, was the thing he'd been doing everything else in order to eventually find. She was twice his height and half his age in wounds, and she had sat down on his camp stool and let him fuss, and she had come back 2 days early for no reason except wanting to, and she had kissed him on a cold wall at dusk and held his face like it was something worth holding, and she had sat outside his door for 14 hours and stood beside him in a market square and claimed him before her whole clan and chosen him, again and again, in every way she knew how. And he had stood between her and every hard thing he could reach, and stitched her wounds and kept her secrets and learned the proper way to say her name in the Grimtide dialect, and organized his shelves by preparation time because he was the kind of person who thought about these things, and told her he was staying and meant it. "Ridge tonight," she said. "Ridge tonight," he agreed. They went. The corridor spread out below them, and the fires of the camp and the settlement and the garrison were all burning at once, and for the first time in a long time none of them looked like warning. They looked like home.